Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here today and to speak to important topics that apply to us as a citizenry, and certainly those of us representing businesses and the impact that these decisions have on us. By nature, I'm an entrepreneur. I dream about disrupting business models, and particularly old-line businesses that don't take early advantage of the opportunities before us. When I think of the early founding of this country, essentially this country was founded on a disruptive idea. For the first time in the history of the world, the notion was put forth that we derived our rights as human beings not from governments or churches, but we derived them direct from a higher power, God, in the case of the founders. And so this disruptive idea could only be preserved, it was believed by the founders, if there remained a free press, the belief being that it would be the tool by which the public were informed as to how their delegated powers were being utilized, and hence the eventual policies that the FCC considers and the ownership rules and other things, all intended to preserve a voice, an independent voice, such that the people remain informed and they have an opportunity to raise up and bring to balance the powers that they've delegated. In 1986, I founded one of the early search engine companies, a company called Pelo, and our mantra at the time was something we called information democracy. In those early days, there were just a few digital online service providers, companies like LexisNexis, that we wanted to disrupt. Our customers were providers of digital data to those large online service providers who charged, on average, $100 to do a simple query. And to us, that was like a Berlin Wall that stood between the everyday man and journalists and researchers who had access to that trove of information. And that seems unbelievable today, given that we have broad and open access to content and those $100 searches, while maybe lawyers still pay for them, and some journalists, by and far, we can do searches today on Google and other search engines that surpass the capability of those early systems. So I think the questions that we address in this forum and others have less to do about information access as they do about the influence of the various distribution models and purveyors of that content, and particularly in this case at the local level. I don't think we'd disagree that the disenfranchised and virtually anyone can have a voice in our communities. When we look at the content that we access on a regular basis, as was referred by earlier comments, we still get most of our news from local sources. I no longer subscribe to a print newspaper myself because I'm able to quickly gather what I need on the internet or on my iPad, and consequently, when I look to national news sources, I'm usually getting that over television, though sometimes on the internet. And so our usage patterns are changing, yet the dominant voices in the local communities remain the local broadcast stations. And I want to address specifically, excuse me, the challenge that we have with television today as it relates to not just spectrum and ownership, but in terms of interactivity. As Eddie mentioned, the tremendous work and effort that is underway among newspapers to just stay alive in an adapting world such as they're dealing with. And one of the things that they've discovered is that the conversation that takes place around the news, the forums next to the news story, the reader comments, are in fact enriching the whole news gathering experience. It's essentially news is beginning the conversation now. In the world of television, we have a little different challenge in that it's not called a boob tube for nothing. You know, we consume as Americans over 5 hours per day of television. It's all passive. There's no conversation that takes place in real time around the television as I should say, is an integrated experience. Now, that isn't to say our behaviors aren't changing. In fact, when my children watch American Idol, they do what I call multi-viewing. You know, they're watching American Idol on the main screen, but they have their laptops and their phones out. They're texting, they're posting updates to their Facebook accounts. They're watching YouTube videos, they're looking on IMDb, they're consuming all sorts of content, participating in a synchronized conversation. Well, television itself it can enable the conversation, but it doesn't synchronize it very well, meaning it doesn't allow us to hear each other's voices very well, and as a result, I think a lot of what has to ultimately happen for television to adapt and survive as a conduit of freedom is for it to figure out how to engage interactively. And I know that term interactive television has traditionally meant additional menus on your screen or ways to interact with programming. What I'm referring to, though, is what we as a society are adapting to among our social networks and interactions around the real-time conversation that we engage in while we're consuming content. And I believe that television has to play an important role eventually in doing that, and that technologies and companies like my own, iTV, are striving to build platforms that allow us to engage in those conversations. One of those significant trends that I think sits on the table right now, my iPad. Tim Baharin last week at PC Magazine editorialized that the iPad may in fact finally liberate the television. A recent survey that was done of new iPad owners showed that 98% of iPad owners use their iPads while watching television. The Nielsen research study called the 3-Screen Study is finding that a lot of the interactivity around television is happening on these second and third screens, your laptops and your iPhones, and that a lot of that interaction is around the content that you're watching. So I believe a day of liberation is in fact upon us with these new devices and new services. And I think it will be a confluence of events that will give voice to the community that's consuming what was once purely a passive medium. Finally, as it relates to media ownership, I understand as a businessman the economies of scale that come through consolidation, particularly in a changing marketplace. As the advertising marketplace changes for newspapers, challenged by free services like Craigslist, to the new digital ad insertions created by FreeWill and its platform, and enabling the various entities to now deliver what were traditionally commercials on any screen, not just the television screen. And as those pressures come to bear, I think what ultimately we have to be watchful of is if all these voices multiply, as we hope they will the dominant voices, those that traditionally have the quality of production and the reputation as our voices within the community, our watchdogs, will they in any way try to inappropriately influence the new interaction that they will face, meaning the voices that they've not been accustomed to having synchronized with their broadcast. In other words, the voices of those that might corroborate the stories that they're telling or things they're saying, but actually might refute them and contest them. And a lot of that behavior, I think, ultimately will determine whether or not the FCC and other governing bodies can consider the actual influence of those dominant historical bodies of news, particularly, and other content, and whether or not those reins can be restricted as other new media platforms have voices of their own that maintain that or create for themselves that same influence. And so I think it's an exciting future. I think all of us here at the table play different roles in that future, and we believe that there will not only be triumphant reentry of the old media companies in these new platforms, but there will be a place for all of us to thrive, and particularly as a society to benefit from. Thank you.